Okay. Good afternoon, distinguished guests and colleagues. I am Samuel Okwade, postdoctoral fellow on the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. This webinar is hosted by the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship, CAS, at the University of Pretoria, in partnership with the Institute for Security Studies and Addis Ababa University, to discuss the topic, the state of African borders post-COVID. African borders keep attracting attention by practitioners and scholars. Just like other regions, COVID-19 pandemic came with its impact on the way we see these borders post-COVID. This goes a long way in determining how African borders are viewed by different state and non-state actors going forward, which would also impact on the implementation process of various policies, both at the national, sub-regional, and regional levels. This webinar does aims to unpack these realities from the theoretical and practical prisms. To assist us unpack this, we have 4 speakers. We have Professor Christopher Msibi from the University of Pretoria. We also have Dr. Margaret Moyani from the Institute for Security Studies. We have Dr. Kia Gezahigni from Addis Ababa University. And finally, we have Rotarian Kunle Adeyanju, an adventurer and border enthusiast from Nigeria. So I will quickly just run through their profiles before we move into the presentations. Professor Christopher Msibi is the director of the Center for the Study of Governance, Innovation, Govin, and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. He holds the South African Research Chairs Initiative, SACHI Research Chair, in the Political Economy of Migration in the Southern African Development Community, SADC region. And he researches regional integration, migration, borders, the informal economy, and governance. Professor Msibi sits in on regional and international technical working groups on trade, labor, migration, and water governance. He will be speaking to us on security issues around African borders pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. Our second speaker, Dr. Margaret Moyani, is a senior migration researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. Prior to joining the ISS, she was a guest researcher at the Center for Human Rights in the Friedrich Alexander University in Germany. She has a PhD in international relations from Wits University here in South Africa, and a research interest on migration, gender, and security. She will be speaking to us on the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in a post-COVID era. Our third speaker, Dr. Kia Gezahigni, is an experienced feminist researcher and an assistant professor based at the Department of Social Anthropology at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. She has been involved in ethnographic research for over 10 years on a range of migration-related areas, including experiences of Ethiopian migrants to and from the Middle East, migration management and livelihoods at the Ethiopian-Sudan border, interlinkages between migration and poverty in Ethiopia, as well as understanding migration and the labor market in Addis Ababa, among others. She has also worked on adolescents and child well-being for over 6 years, focusing on education, bodily integrity, health and nutrition, psychosocial well-being, economic empowerment, and voice and agency. She will be speaking to us on the effects, or if we like, the implications of COVID on the borderlands, the borderlanders, as well as on cross-border movements in the post-COVID era. Lastly, we have Rotarian Kunle Adeyanju, who is a successful professional in the oil and gas industry. I'm sure many would ask, why is he speaking to us? You would know that shortly. Beyond this, he has a strong passion for adventure and border, and that is what has qualified him to be speaking to us today. He's widely traveled and has visited over 70 countries around the world. He has cycled Lagos, Nigeria to Ghana and back to Lagos. In 2008, he became the first Nigerian to fly the Nigerian flag at the highest peak in Africa, Uhuru Peak, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the first Rotarian to fly the Rotary banner at this highest peak. In December 2009, himself and his team attempted Mount Kilimanjaro for the second time, but nature resisted this time around. His experience, which he tagged the failed but successful mission, has been documented in his book titled My Escape on Kili. This can be found on Apple Bookstore and Amazon. A giant stride made by Rotarian Adeyanju was the Trans-Sahara motorbike adventure, London to Lagos, which started on the 19th April 2022 to reinvigorate awareness for end polio and raise funds for the charity cause. The ride took a global dimension where a lot of people found inspiration and motivation in it. He completed the ride on the 29th of May 2022. He will be sharing with us his experience at the borders and in the various borderlands as he crossed and journeyed through them all the way from North Africa down to West Africa. So each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes, and then a Q&A session, which would last for about 20 minutes, would follow immediately. The concluding session, which is equally an important part of this webinar, would take the last 15 minutes. So without further ado, I would call on our first speaker, Professor Chris, to make his presentation. 20 minutes, please. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to this webinar. Very coherent.
You are breaking. You are breaking. We can't hear you well. You are breaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Now we can hear you.
Yes, so I was saying that I was thank you for inviting me to be that my task here is basically to raise some dust in order to stimulate debate and also discussion on the issue of borders. So not very coherently, but I'll just raise some issues that would then therefore enable us to engage with one another and see the way forward. I'll talk about borders and human mobility as it relates to borders. If I touch on security, then it will only, or at least it will be largely be insofar as it relates to human security and not security in the traditional sense. Securitization theory, for example, talks of turning ordinary issues such as migration or health into security issues that are then deemed to be a threat to a nation or to a group of people and so on and so forth. So my interest in human security here would actually be because this is where securitization has implications on individuals when borders or human mobility are securitized. And when I talk of borders, basically, I first of all define them from a state-centric point of view as lines of separation at the margins of a state. So they basically are markers of state territory, and they tend to be static, they are fixed, and also they are homogeneous. But
We lost you. We can't hear you again. Okay.
I think I was lost there.
Yeah, we lost you for a few seconds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it should be my network due to. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know where you lost me, but I was basically trying to define borders, especially from a state-centric point of view, where they are depicted as lines of separation, and these normally are at the margins of the state, and they are markers of state territory, and they tend to be static, they are fixed, they are homogeneous. But then I was saying that we need to go beyond that definition of borders as lines and look at some binaries that normally are created that distinguish especially people on the basis of belonging. So we have groups that would say they are the us, and then they distinguish themselves from other groups, which are the them. And when you start following those definitions of borders, it even goes further and goes down to markers that then categorize human beings or even the human body on the basis of gender, on the basis of skin color, on the basis of ethnicity, culture, and language, and so on. So we can extend the definition of border from strictly speaking about the lines in the sand that separate nation states to go on to the human body, and then separations between groups and categories of body, or hierarchization of bodies and people, if you like. So then that would lead me to talk about the functions of borders, and starting with the broader definition of borders as markers of territory. In their traditional conception, in that sense, as lines that separate of separation between countries, they serve several functions, and these may actually facilitate or hinder the movement of people. And it does relate to the issue of COVID-19 that we are discussing. So just quickly to give 4 key functions of borders in that sense. So there will be, as I have hinted, there will be markers of territory. And in that sense, they will demarcate the territorial limits of the jurisdictional authority of countries that are separated by the border. So South Africa is a state, it has a territory. Zimbabwe is a state, it has a territory, and they are demarcated by these lines that define the limits of the jurisdictional authority of Harare or Pretoria, if you like. Then secondly, and again, I've hinted at this, they determine inclusion and exclusion, in the sense that they create or they reflect difference. And in that sense, they constitute the separation line, not only between states and geographical locations, but also between the us and the them, or the here and there, or what we may call the insiders and outsiders. So in that sense, you either belong to a particular state or country or not, or you belong to a particular group. Maybe you are categorized as a male or a female, and so on and so forth, based on various those binaries that I talked about earlier. And then thirdly, the borders provide an inclusionary basis for democratic citizenship, of course, and in this case, they serve as markers of citizenship rights. So somebody may be within a given state territory, but then there's that inclusionary basis upon which they are regarded as a non-citizen. And that has implications for what they can do within a territory that accommodates them. So for example, just off the top of my head, you may be a citizen of another country who may enjoy various services and rights, but maybe the right to vote, for example, you may not be able to enjoy it. And because the borders define you on the basis of you being included within in the activities that are performed within the country that you are hosted. And so in fulfilling an inclusionary and the exclusionary function, borders also regulate movements of citizens or foreigners or some countries actually call them aliens. Very funny, but you find even in the regulations and also legislations of countries that you wouldn't even think about, they call foreign individuals or people that visit their countries as aliens. But then there's also the regulation of capital, the regulation of goods and services between territories. And so even in performing this exclusionary function, then they will fulfill the fourth function, which is the regulation of movement. And here they will present barriers to the movement of people, to the movement of goods and capital and services and so forth. So having laid out those four functions of borders, I come to the COVID-19 moment and the implications on borders at that moment. I call it a COVID-19 moment because even when COVID broke out, at least in my mind, I thought it was a phase that the world was going through. It would come, it would last for a certain period of time, and then would move past that. Even if people talked about the new normal, but still, it is something that happened, and then we are past that. Whether we are completely out of the woods is another, is a question for another discussion, but I consider it to have been a moment. So what we saw, obviously, in that moment were border closures. We had restrictions on human mobility, although this was not achieved 100%, especially on the African continent. So we had countries, for example, like Zambia, that actually never went into total lockdown vis-a-vis the closure of international boundaries or international borders. Even if within the territory, they had restrictions, they imposed restrictions, which are even so populist politicians massively abusing human rights. But we had a situation in some countries where borders were not completely closed. Now, speaking of abuse, the actions of politicians that I've referred to, like in the cases of Zambia, actually speaks to one of the implications of the border closures, which was the abuse of power and authority. And this manifested at the physical border in many countries and also within states. So a lot can be said here about the state and how it gained overarching control within its jurisdiction to the point of actually being very intrusive in people's private lives. We can talk even about the abuses that state agencies are engaged in the name of ensuring that there was restrictions of movement due to the COVID-19 or in the name of trying to curb the spread of the disease. In the case of South Africa, also another point I can make is that COVID-19 coincided with the enactment of the Border Management Authority. Although this plans for the establishment of the Management Authority preceded the pandemic, but the COVID-19 moment actually provided a convenient time to implement the idea. And this will have long-term effects. The Border Management Authority is one of the issues that is going to have long-term effects on long-term post-COVID effects in terms of the way borders are managed in South Africa and vis-a-vis its neighbors. The other issue I would raise or throw out there is the matter of COVID vaccinations. So you will find some scholars on especially migration and health actually labeled the COVID-19 vaccination and vaccination campaigns in the COVID-19 moment as vaccinationalism. And this is because many asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented migrants who happened to be within the territories of states that were not their countries of origin were ignored and excluded from state-based COVID-19 pandemic preparedness plans and also national vaccination programs. I can cite some exploratory research that was conducted by MEPO and others, for example, on access to COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. And this showed in the whole continent, it showed that South Africa practiced vaccine nationalism, vaccine exclusion, and discrimination against asylum seekers, refugees, and also migrants that are undocumented. There's even notoriously then Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize's response to a question in an SABC News interview. That was on 30 January 2021. He seemed to confirm the study that was conducted by MEPO and others. He told SABC News that the COVID vaccine rollout would be limited to citizens of South Africa only. And the reason he gave was that undocumented foreign nationals, the state had no capacity rather to help undocumented nationals, foreign nationals. But of course, 2 days later, the president of the country issued a statement that government would institute measures to address the challenge of undocumented migrants, and that the state aimed to avail the vaccine to all adults who lived in the country, irrespective of residence status or citizenship. So from the state point of view, we had this issue within the executive branch of government, where attempts or at least signs of discriminating against migrants in terms of accessing vaccines was evident. But on their part, if you look at the migrants or the asylum seekers or refugees and undocumented people, they actually hesitated to go and get vaccinated for COVID-19. And they had reasons for doing this. They partly feared that they would be treated badly for being foreigners, or that they would be reported to police and get arrested or deported. And of course, their fears had a solid basis. There have been extensive studies that have been conducted that provide evidence to the effect that even before COVID-19, the refugees, the asylum seekers, all those undocumented migrants actually avoid services of the country's public health services. And they do that because they do not possess maybe immigration documents. But even when they possess, the fear is that they are convinced that visiting such institutions would eventually lead to arrest or deportation, but also they fear that the health service providers in those institutions might actually refuse to attend to them because they do not possess immigration documents. I don't even want to talk about a video clip that went viral about the treatment of a woman that was or had just been in labor. And speaking of human security, from a human security point of view, whatever the case may have been, but at least at the very basic level in terms of human security, human dignity, when you speak of treating a woman that has come from that moment of performing a very basic human function, and then you expose them to such humiliation, I think, anyway, I won't give an opinion on that. Then also, basically what I'm trying to make, the point I'm trying to make is that we see-
Okay, you have 2 more minutes.
Yes, we see vaccinationalism playing out within countries, but also at regional and international levels. So there was this division between the so-called global north and global south with regards to the provision of vaccines. But even within, for example, the so-called global north, you had member states of the EU, for example, that were divided with regard to the vaccines that they would use and so on and so forth. COVID-19 in Southern Africa, of course, it did lead to the closure of borders, and among the groups that were affected were cross-border traders. Those were, because the informal cross-border traders, by the way, because their livelihoods are based on that informal trade, and the restrictions on their movement had a great impact on their livelihoods. There's more that we can talk about this. And of course, lastly, since I have a minute to go, in the ways of President Ramaphosa, there was the other pandemic, which has long-term consequences during the COVID-19 moment. And of course, that's gender-based violence. And I don't even want to say much. There's been various attempts to address this. People have protested. We've been promised legislation to deal with this, but at least that this type of violence was amplified or magnified during the COVID-19 moment. I think I won't stop there. I have a very bad habit of not concluding when I speak, and then I think we can continue after in the question and answer session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Chris. Thank you for that insightful presentation. You've actually raised a conversation, you've stirred up a conversation on African borders post-COVID, and that has to do with looking beyond the traditional meaning of security and looking at it from human security perspective, which actually gives and assures human dignity. So I would just, I know people would have questions and comments to share on this. So while we move into the second presentation, I will just say that people can drop their comments and questions in the Q&A session. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll have that time to actually engage more. Thank you. I'll call on Dr. Margaret Monyenin to give a presentation. Over to you. Dr. Margaret, we can't hear you.
Yes. Thank you, Samuel. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much for honoring our invitation to attend this webinar on borders and migration governance in the post-COVID era. So like I've been introduced, I'm Margaret Monyani, the Senior Migration Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. And this afternoon, my presentation will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the freedom of movement, in particular, the challenges that are facing the implementation of the freedom of movement protocol. I will basically be referring to some of the research findings of a policy brief that I co-authored with my colleague, Otilia Maunganidze, which definitely was looking at the examines the adoption of freedom of movement protocol in comparison to the African Continental Free Trade Area, the CFTA, what I'll be calling so. So, yeah, the research findings, of course, affirm that the implementation of the freedom of movement protocol could have significant benefits for the Africa because it can promote social integration, enhance cross-border infrastructure projects, and generally just foster Pan-African identity. It could also improve intra-African knowledge and skill sharing, enhance tourism, and many other benefits. But there is a reluctance on the parts of the government they seem to give a lot of support on CFTA as compared to the freedom of movement protocol. It's 5 years because it was adopted in 2018, but we see now, if we look at the progress, actually 2023, the theme of the AU is the year of CFTA. So, which is very ironic. Goods cannot cross borders without people. It doesn't make sense. So, yeah. So the COVID-19, like the first presenter has called it the COVID-19 moment, of course, disrupted many aspects of society, not just in Africa, but globally, including freedom of movement in Africa. Of course, it was argued that the virus was, not argued, actually the virus being highly contagious, governments implemented travel restrictions then to curb its spread. Unfortunately, these restrictions significantly impacted mobility across borders, creating challenges for migrants, businesses, and economy. So I hope that my presentation will spark some fruitful discussions. So why is freedom of movement important, and especially for Africa? We have a blueprint, the Agenda 2063 blueprint, which was adopted way back in 2013. It outlines the goals for the continent to achieve by 2060. And one of them includes, they say we need to achieve a politically united and integrated continent based on Pan-Africanist values. How can this be achieved? This is by allowing unrestricted movement of people within the continent, because as it is, as of at the time, of course, the stats have changed. In 2018, when they were adopting the FPM, the Freedom of Movement Protocol, it hasn't changed so much. At least 50% of Africans still require visas to travel to other half of the other African countries. And this is very detrimental, just even to the trade that is being promoted currently. So if approved, the protocol could have a positive impact on trade, not just on trade. Yeah. So in 2020, when actually it is ironic because it was the journey for the FPM was to start, but it is the same year that we went into lockdown as articulated by the first presenter. And then it became like a beginning of immobility on the continent. And so various restrictions and policies and practices were adopted. Yeah. So mobility plays a significant role in as far as African regional integration agenda is confirmed. And just the adoption of the FPM is just one of the many policies that African states have adopted to enhance freedom of movement. In fact, several other progressive policy frameworks at the regional and continental level, such as migration policy framework for Africa, single African air transport market, the AU strategy for better integrated border governance, have long come before the free movement persons protocol. So it has been a journey. So this is in the recognition of the critical role that migration, of course, plays in enhancing socioeconomic development in both countries of origin and also the destination countries. So it is anticipated that through the implementation of the protocol, then connections will be established through transnational activities like capital investment, philanthropy, knowledge transfer, and many other that have mentioned before. And also, why freedom of movement? Just to mention an important, there is the existence of informal pathways for trade, commonly known as informal cross-border trade. It is a common phenomenon in Africa where unregistered companies and informal traders, especially women, frequently buy and sell goods across border. So what a better way to allow them to be freely cross this border by having safe and regular channels for them to engage in trade. So the value of the ICBT, that is the informal cross-border trade, actually as it is, cannot be exhaustively be quantified. Why? We don't have data. There is no infrastructure that can, though there are some studies that actually say the value of informal commerce, that's the value of ICBT, actually may equal or even exceed the value of formal trade for certain goods and for certain countries. So, but then the recognition of the significant contribution of ICBT has been hindered by, like I say, by lack of reliable data. So if this, the freedom of movement protocol is implemented as per the stages, of course, there are phases. There are 3 phases that have been outlined. Then this, we will be able to monitor the significance of this kind of trade. And then when I'm talking about ICBT, actually I'm reminded of some work by Innocent Moyo, who actually examined the ICBT, the impact of closure of the South Africa-Zimbabwe border due to COVID-19, the COVID moment, as my other colleagues called it, on informal cross-border trade. And so what does he find out? Moyo discovered that the border closure forced those actors to modify their strategies. The traders found ways to navigate the borders and so that they can move goods and money across the border. Some actually resorted to circumventing official checkpoints or utilizing unusual methods. For instance, hiding goods and money in coffins to illegally cross into Zimbabwe. It just tells you how enduring this and important livelihood strategy this ICBT is to people who cross, the traders who cross borders, and it cannot be ignored. I could go on and on, but then I just want to go straight into what did our research find out in terms of why are African states adopting, having support more for the CFTA as compared to FBA. Of course, that is the freedom of movement protocol. First, the numbers. Of course, 44 countries already have deposited the instrument of ratification in support of the CFTA, the trade aspect of it. But when it comes to the freedom of movement, only 4 countries, and actually the smaller countries, let me use that term, because in countries like Mali, smaller, as in terms of economically, countries like South Africa have actually ratified it. So the first reason, of course, I'll mention 4 quickly. The first reason concerns the fear around mass migration from less developed countries to the more developed countries. There is that fear among the middle income countries, including South Africa. And I don't know if Nigeria should should be also be added to the list, because I'm just having an interesting example of where I was reading recently a piece by CNN. It's either 3 or 4 days ago about the Japa wave. So in fact, if I may quote, the CNN says, "May Nigeria not happen to you." It looks like a common prayer in Africa's largest economy. It's considered so, but it's a prayer that, so a country, Nigeria is said to be experiencing the Japa wave. Japa wave, the Yoruba word for run or flee, has become a shorthand for exodus out of Nigeria for better pastures overseas. So one of the people that were interviewed, one of the interviews commented that, "I'm Japaing, leaving the country because of the opportunities that are available to me abroad." And we know, of course, the Nigerians are not just moving on the continent, but also to the north. So why? Of course, the article details, among many other things, is the issue, the fact that the pandemic, of course, crippled economies. Of course, there's the issue of corruption and many other things. And then we have also the recent unfortunate sentiments by President Kais Saied, who claimed migrants from sub-Saharan Africa were aimed at changing his country's demographic makeup. Of course, the AU wasn't happy about it, and they issued a statement to that regard. The second reason in the reluctance to adopt the free movement protocol concerns the state sovereignty. And I think the first speaker spoke to this, because sovereignty and borders, sovereignty and documented migrants, and the fear that free movement could propel insecurity. Sovereignty, you know, it gives states, it remains a critical feature that allows states to control their borders and internal affairs. So perhaps maybe just unpacking the word free movement. Maybe we haven't educated our common citizens on the continent, because it comes off like someone can just wake up and cross borders anyhow, but that's not what it is about. It's about gradually getting rid of the barriers. Like, I think the most expensive visa I've ever paid for in my travels is being on the continent. If you've traveled on the continent, you know it's very expensive. Even air tickets are more expensive than flying to Europe. So these are the issues that needs to be taken care of if we want to achieve regional integration. So there is the concern that allowing free movement of people across borders will interfere with sovereignty. While some of these concerns are unfounded, some people would say so, they should not be overlooked. Actually, there is need for proper discussions at bilateral level, multilateral level to deal with these fears. And then the third reason, of course, just to expound more on that, is that the emerging threats such as terrorism, extremism, human trafficking, they're more prevalent now. And I think the presence of ISIS in Mozambique is a very good recent example that this thing is on the continent, it's live here. And so the neighboring countries will be hesitant just to open borders, because there is the fear that they could cross over into their territories. And then there is the issue of course, there are steps towards that, but then there is the free movement without corresponding regulatory measures. to mitigate the risks that, like the ones I have mentioned, is seen in this context as a challenge rather than opportunity. So as a prerequisite for the implementation of FPM, actually African states are expected to put in place robust digital identification systems. But as it is, many countries on the continent don't have their digitized civil registers, and for many reasons. Very few, actually up to only 3 countries have fully digitized their civil registers, and we are talking about 55 countries, we have 54, 55 countries, you know. So the state of digital registers is still, of course, it varies from country to country. Some countries are at 1%, some are 2%, you know. But a major challenge, of course, there's no infrastructure in many of these countries, particularly in rural areas where now access to internet, electricity is limited, and that is a requirement to be able to get the register people digitally. Of course, the issue of money, capacity building becomes an issue. So despite these challenges, also I need to mention that there have been some successes, just a little bit, in digitizing civil registers in Africa. For example, countries like Ghana, they have implemented a digital birth registration system. Kenya, there was Huduma number, developed a digital identification system as well, and also Nigeria, Uganda as well. There is some little bit of progress. But overall, the state of digital registers in Africa is still mixed, and it's really very critical for countries to be able to monitor where people, and it's not just for states, for their own security, it's also for the security of migrants. Been in a workshop where it was mentioned, sometimes migrants are in different countries and they lose their lives, they die, and then they can't just get hold of their, people back home to get their, they don't have even embassies here, or they didn't have documents, but they were working. Their benefits, how do they get to their families? So there's no record to that effect. So it's not just, the records are not just important for states, but for the migrants as well. So the third reason is for the reluctance to adopt the free movement protocol is COVID-19 pandemic. Why? It has wreaked havoc on economies. And then now we have this discourse or rhetoric calls to prioritize citizens over migrants. Now they're gaining even more momentum. So in this context, then it looks like the CFTA holds promise of recovering from the pandemic and rebuilding Africa's resilience as compared to freedom of movement. So maybe when we talk about this, does put South Africa first ring bell? Yes. So you see the growth of the put South Africa's first movement reflects one of the economic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, which led, of course, to the economic decline. So the proponents of this movement advocate for policies that should prioritize South African citizens over foreign nationals. They base their claims on high levels of crime, unemployment, poverty in the country, which they believe is amplified by the presence of foreign nationals in the country. Of course, they have been criticized about that because there is the argument that actually migrants have contributed to this economy, to the South African economy. And again, blaming foreign nationals for South Africa's problems ignores deeper structural issues such as inequality, corruption, and lack of job opportunities. Those are the critics. And then lastly, is lack of corresponding robust protective structures that have also led to the reluctance to ratify the free movement protocol. So there is of course, the way the phases are structured, they're supposed to relent on border regulation and control. But then,
sorry, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, actually I'm almost through. Without corresponding robust protective structures, then it's seen as a risk. So critical infrastructure is required to ensure that members experience equitable gains from both just the trade and also the freedom of movement protocol. Yes, so basically that. So I will go to the next, those are the 4 reasons. So what are some of the recommendations that we outlined in the policy brief? Of course, we gave different recommendations for different categories of policymakers, governments, the CFTA's secretariat itself, and what. And the reluctance is not just seen at the state level. I'm actually reliably informed that if there is anyone here at the AU, please correct me. There is only one desk there at the AU with 1 individual or 2 individuals dealing with the freedom of movement protocol. Yet there is a whole secretariat for CFTA in Ghana and really fully equipped. So that also weighs on that. So I will mention 2 or 3 recommendations that we set out in our policy brief. It's on our website. We can share the link. I'll share the link in the chats now. You can go on and read about it. Some of the recommendations we gave out to African governments is the need to adopt a progressive approach to free movement that allows states to negotiate their own pathways to reaping the benefits of CFTA and FPM. Then establishment of common standards on trade and mobility, including, for example, national labor, immigration, professional licensing, and informal cross-border trade. And then, of course, the digital identification system is very critical, just not for states, like I mentioned, but also for the migrants for themselves, so that you can trace your journey for your own security, so that even the fact that migrants are able to fall into these hands of trafficking, it is because usually they don't have documents, or they have illegal, or they got some documents from some quarters, So, and lastly, establish a regional labor market information database that allows employers to find the people they need regardless of where they live. So in conclusion, I know my time is up, and of course, we will be able to discuss this further in the Q&A. What comes to mind when I was thinking about this seminar is that if historical precedent is anything to go by, we see that if we look at the case of 9/11, usually drastic measures that are adopted to deal with those kind of crises, like the 9/11, they persist long after the event is gone. So if these restrictions that were adopted in terms of border management, and if they persist, what does it mean for the rights and safety of refugees or migrants if the COVID-related restrictions continue indefinitely? Maybe this is one of the issues we need to discuss. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Moyani. Thank you for sharing your study findings with us. And it speaks to reasons, you've advanced reasons why African states favor the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement more than the Free Movement Protocol, which actually predates the Continental Free Trade. And I'm sure, this must have stirred up some thoughts in the minds of some of the attendees. Like I said, would have this conversation at the end of the presentation. Let me call on Dr. Kia to make a presentation. Over to you, Dr. Kia.
Thank you, Samuel. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me on this seminar. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a bit of presentation. Can you see the screen? Hello?
Yes, we can see you. We can see you. We can see the presentation.
I will try to talk about the borderlands in Ethiopia, which are off the grid in most of the discussions we have here in the country and outside. And I'm an anthropologist by training, so I will bring you down to the reality on what's going on the ground and talk more about the impacts of COVID along the Ethiopian-Sudan border in particular, where I did most of my research. So to give you a bit of a context to the situation in Ethiopia with regard to the pandemic, the first case was identified and reported on March 2020. And there was 2 weeks of lockdown, which was announced by the government, but and containment measures were put in place, like restriction on social gatherings, wearing face masks, which was mandatory, and also physical distancing. However, these measures were not that serious in a way that they were hardly enforced by the government or by the general public after more or less 2 weeks. This is just a brief context of the situation we had in Ethiopia. But what I want to talk most about would be the perception of the pandemic and the difference it has when it is at the center of the country and also along the borderlands. So for people at the center, the majority believe that the pandemic was more of a political conspiracy or an attack against religion. And there was this widespread belief that we as Ethiopians and at large Africans are protected and are the chosen ones. So there was it was considered as a white man's pandemic, and then that we are protected by our face. For those of you who are not very familiar with the country, it's a very religious state, and so religious teachings of the apocalypse was very much common. Even if, as you can see in the numbers of the total days, it was significant, and the spread of the pandemic was very much existent in the country. So this was a sentiment at the center of the country, and also the fact that the pandemic was taken as a political tool. So these were the discussions we had at the center of the country, I can say, with regard to the postponing of the national election, which led to state of emergency, and later on to the conflict between the TPLF government in the north in Tigray region and the federal government, which stayed for almost 2 years and up to recently of conflict. So this is more or less what we perceived was the pandemic about. However, when it comes to the borderlands, it was more about existence. It was more about restriction on movement, which constitutes the mere existence of borderland people in borderland communities. So the place I'm going to talk about is the border between Ethiopia and Sudan in the north, and the border town called Metama and Galabat. And this border town gained significance, particularly after the cessation of Eritrea from Ethiopia in 1991, where Ethiopia became a landlocked country. So this border point basically gave access point to Port Sudan for Ethiopians. And also with the secession of South Sudan from Sudan, Metama and the rest part of the borderland communities on the Ethiopian side also provided agricultural laborers to the land, to the large-scale plantations in eastern part of Sudan. So this is a place where there is a number of mobilities and also have economic as well as political significance. And when it comes to COVID and the implication it had on this borderland, the first part is the restriction on mobility. So there was a strict travel restriction and border closure to avoid cross-border transmissions of COVID-19. As I've said, there was a country wide restriction for 2 weeks, but in the borderlands, it stayed for more than that time. And later on, because of also the conflict that we had in the northern part of the country, but also the impact on essential cross-border movement. So this area of the country gains access to a number of goods from Sudan and also on the other side from Ethiopia because of its distance from the center of the state. So the closure of the border and strict travel restrictions had a negative impact on essentials that the community needed, and it disrupted the border economy, which was basically dependent on cross-border mobility. And also we can talk about family and social ties, which has been disrupted because of the closure of the border and also the facilitation of other means of movements across the border. So because of the closure, rather than communication between the Sudanese and Ethiopian communities, the Ethiopians on the western part of the country has merged relation with other border points and also trade relations with other hubs in the area. Another important thing with regard to mobility would be its impact on smuggling and trafficking. So particularly on this part of the border, as I mentioned earlier, on the Ethiopian side, migrants, particularly labor migrants, seasonal labor migrants to be specific, travel to Sudan and other borderland areas to engage in large-scale commercial farms, and the restriction on mobility also largely affected those kind of movements. And in 2017, it was estimated the numbers were to be around 70,000 to 80,000 per year, but that has increased in 2019 and in 2020 to up to 300,000. So the scale is significant. However, that movement has been disrupted because of COVID and the closure of the border. But that does not mean people have not been moving across the border. Particularly, they have been using unauthorized entry points. This is a border that runs around 1,600 kilometers, including South Sudan, and if I'm not mistaken, 800 kilometers with Sudan only. And so it's very much, we cannot call it what is now termed as the hard border control. So people have managed to find this entry points and cross the border illegally, which causes or puts them in a very, very vulnerable situation or in a risk situation. Another issue that has been noticed with regard to smuggling and trafficking has been also the change in broker or traffickers network. So we have known that there has been a chain of brokers and traffickers between Sudan and Ethiopia, and that goes up to Libya and across. However, because of the restriction on mobility, the traffickers network has changed to countries where there was less restrictions. So it has been taken over, for instance, from Ethiopians by the Sudanese and also by Eritreans, where there has been loose restriction on movement. And also the fact that with regard with the coming of the pandemic and the inflation that we have noticed then after, people have been engaging in such type of activities that was brought to them as because of the fact that they are living along the border. And another lucrative business that came up is also the trade in guns and other assets that came in from Sudan to Ethiopia, which later on also supported the war we had in the north. So all this happened during the pandemic and during the closure of the border, and then continued afterwards. Another implication is also on borderland governance, where we've seen weak government institutions and the capacity of the borderland government to deal with pandemic and also the aftermath of such pandemics, where there is limited capacity in the health sectors and also weak border security. So there was no means of tracing, contact tracing, and also test points along the border, besides the restriction of the mobility. And the government institutions were also not equipped or did not have the capacity to deal with the economic disruption that came along with the pandemic, and also with the in providing health services to residents of the border community. And this has been the case for long because of the negligence that has happened of the borderland community and the borderland area in general as compared to other parts of the country. However, with the pandemic, the impact had been very much visible. And another hindrance to the borderland governance was the fact that the borderland is very much characterized with the high prevalence of informal activity, be it informal movement or informal trade. And so it was very much difficult to control this kind of mobility or movement of goods and people. And also inflation that came along with the pandemic, and very much related to also the greater insecurity and instability in the area. So when we talk about insecurity and instability, we can talk about the conflicts we have in the north between Tigray and the national government, and also the clashes we had over the border demarcation since 2020. this border has not been physically demarcated, and there has been questions from residents on both sides for the governments to come to an agreement where the border lies, and that has not been done, and it has been a cause for most conflicts over resources, particularly land and water resources. And this has heightened during the pandemic, where people were in a situation where there was uncertainty of their future, and also where they are heading economically as well as in general. And there has also been clashes between Ethiopian and Sudanese militaries, where governments took this chance or this opening of the loose border control to claim land, and that has happened in 2020 and in 2021, where we have seen major clashes between the Ethiopian and Sudanese soldiers. Another important aspect with the implication of COVID on borderland communities would be the reversed power dynamics that we have seen between the periphery and the center. So as is noted in many literatures, the center holds the power, whereas the periphery is the most neglected part of most states. However, with the coming of COVID and also the importance of the border to the existence of the center, this has shifted into the periphery, but it has not stayed that far. After the pandemic, we have seen the power dynamics return back to the center, and also the perception towards the pandemic was very much related to the mistrust the community had towards central government, because particularly in relation to mobility restriction. So the government stated forced the borders to be closed. However, there were no restriction when it comes to the airlines we have. So Ethiopian is known for its airlines services, and that has not been shut down. So there has been, I would say, negative attitude towards this mobility restriction, which later on affected also the relation between the borderland community and the central government. When it comes to cross-border movement in particular, as you can see on the figure, there are different types of movements along the border, and this has been disrupted because of the pandemic. And we have also seen with this disruption transformation on the ethnic makeup of the borderland communities, not only because of the pandemic, but also the conflict that we had later on. So Metemma area, Humera area, and the border we have between Ethiopia and Sudan is mostly predominantly Amhara and Tigray ethnic groups, but because of the conflict, the Tigrayans have fled to Tigray region, and also we have seen this separation between the Sudanese and the Ethiopian society. And Professor Chris was saying that there is this binaries created between us and them, and this is exactly what happened along the Ethiopian-Sudan border, where previously they lived as one community. However, with the pandemic and the closure of the border, which disrupted the daily experiences, there was clear division between the two communities of the Sudanese and the Ethiopians, and also among Ethiopians between the Amharas and the Tigrayans and other ethnic groups. We have also seen change in mobility patterns, as I have mentioned earlier. Rather than communication or relation between the Sudanese and the Ethiopians, the interaction has been limited within the country. And so economic interaction, for instance, has been limited within the communities or the towns that are along the borderlines, but within the country's territory than across. We have also noted vulnerability of migrants and refugees, particularly in refugee camps and in reception centers, in detention centers in Sudan as well as Ethiopia, where there was no attention given to them in protecting themselves from the pandemic and also post-pandemic era, in rehabilitating returnees from the different countries, including from Sudan. There has also been suspicion of people on the move, which basically hindered the cross-border movement, which was very much fluid before the pandemic. And that is not only, as I have mentioned again and again, not only because of the pandemic, but also closely related to the conflict we had. We have also seen engagement of seasonal migrants in the conflict in different conflicts, including the war in the north particularly because of the lack of economic opportunities in the area, which basically led them to be idle, as many mentioned, and for them to look into opportunities, which at that time and place was to engage in conflict, be it by directly engaging us in the conflict or indirectly assisting such mobilities. So in conclusion, I can say that because earlier professor said the border defines you, and the border defining you, but it's in existence, particularly because of the pandemic, as they know it, has disrupted their daily lives. And so it was very much difficult for the borderland communities to live what we call the normal life post-conflict, post-COVID and post-conflict era. I think I will end my presentations here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for still leaving a bit of 6 minutes for us. I mean, thank you very much. You know, the fact that borderlands are situated on the periphery of the state always puts them at that disadvantaged position of government policies vis-a-vis policies on migration and border management and all that cannot be overemphasized. I mean, your presentation and the case study which you have presented further deepens that conversation. And I think there should be a way forward how borderlands should be put into this whole discussion when policies such as these are being made, because it definitely affects them directly. I would move to the last presentation, and then I hand over to Mr. Adeyanju to make his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I've listened to all the speakers. I'll be sharing my slide too, like Dr. Kia, if I'm right. Okay, thank you. Please just give me a hi, just to be sure you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all
and
right.
We can also see your slide.
All right, thanks. Okay. All right, my name is Rotirankunle Adeyanju. I'm going to be sharing my experience, a practical experience transiting the African borders. As I was introduced earlier, I'm a border enthusiast. I've had the opportunity to actually crisscross over 80 borders around the world. I've been to about 80 countries in all the continents of the world. Most of the experiences have been, via air, via flying into all these countries. But recently, that's in May last year, April 19th precisely, I decided to embark on a road trip, and which I tagged the London to Lagos Trans-Sahara Motorbike Adventure. And that took me, riding my bike from London down to Lagos, Nigeria. That's crisscrossing from Europe down into North Africa, into West Africa. So I'll be sharing the experience with you and what I found out crossing the African borders. So in my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about this. So basically, we'll be looking at what is the inspiration, what drove me to actually do the motorbike adventure. Then the second one, why did I tag the ride to end polio? Then third, I'm going to be talking about the preparation. How did I get to, transit all these borders to actually do the ride from London to Lagos? Then I'll talk about the experience on the border itself. Then there also, I'm going to be sharing, to break this down, looking at the experience in Europe, then also the experience in Africa. Then when people ask me that after going through all this, what is my most important takeout from this experience? And I say to people, without actually missing my word, is the discovery of the true African story. So let's start. Why the Trans-Sahara Motorbike Adventure? Why did I ride, crossing all the borders, basically crossing 13 countries and 42 major cities around the world? So that's crossing 13 borders to arrive from London to Lagos, Nigeria. The inspiration actually not that, just woke up from sleep one day and decided to do this, but it's been my way of life to do adventures. And I remember in 2019, I decided to ride a bicycle from Lagos, Nigeria to Ghana. That's crossing 3 borders along the way. That's crossing Benin Republic and crossing Togo, then down into Ghana. And it was a very challenging experience. And I actually did that because I was asking myself where is my limit? How can I stretch myself? How can I continually raise the bar? And I said, okay, what can I do to really, really stretch me? And I did this ride. It was really painful. I mean, after the ride, it took me 3 days to ride my bicycle from Lagos to Ghana and 3 days back. After doing it for 6 days, I got back to Lagos. I couldn't sit down. It was saddle sore all through, but it gave me a very good experience of, going through all these challenges. And while on this ride, I think I should put it, maybe when you're a cyclist and you're crossing the border, there's a lot of sympathy for you, because it was quite seamless crossing the border on my bicycle and through these countries. Now let's go to, why did I tag the ride to ending polio? For me, polio was a personal fight. Growing up as a boy, my best friend when I was in elementary school had polio, and I knew what it is for someone to actually, a polio survivor, to live with the virus, because it's really debilitating and it really limits someone's life. So when I wanted to do this Trans-Saharan motorbike adventure, and I said to myself, it's gonna be selfish of me if I just hop on my bike and just do the ride. But can I use this very difficult and challenging ride to address some of these humanitarian causes? The answer is yes. And I chose polio because, like I said, it was a personal fight for me. Now, the route selection. How did I go?
Sorry, Mr. Adeyanju, before you proceed, please, can you walk with your slides? I think you're still on slide 2.
Oh, on slide 2? Okay. Sorry, which slide can you see now? Because I'm on slide...
You're still on slide 2.
Okay, so can you see the slide 3 now?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Can I just continue, or I should just take it from here?
No, just continue. Just continue.
Okay, all right. So I was talking about the preparation and how did I do what I did? And it took quite a lot. It took me a year to build the plan, and there are quite a lot of things I needed to consider. The first one was the route selection. And looking at the route selection, going into Google and plotting the map, how do I get from London to Lagos? There are 2 ways you can do it. The first one is to go through the coastline, which is where I went to, where you see my cursor now. That's going to be like about 12,000 kilometers. But the other one, which is this one here, you see going through Algeria down into Niger Republic, then down into Lagos, Nigeria, is going to be about 8,000 kilometers. So the question is, why did I opt for 12,000 kilos when I could do it at a shorter distance of 8,000 kilos? And the basic thing there is, along this coastline, the distance between settlement is about 500 kilometers. While the distance between settlement going through Algeria, the central part of the Sahara, you have a distance of about 8,300 kilos. So it's a lot easier to solve the challenges of crossing 500 kilos than solving the challenges of crossing 1,300 kilos. So those are basically what informed I going through the coastline. So then I had to look at, the entry permits, what kind of equipment do I need to actually do this ride? Then accessories that I need to actually help me to transit all these borders. Then I look at my journey management. Do I just hop on the bike and ride till I get tired? Is that how I want to do this? Or I have a defined distance. What amount of pressure, torture can my body take every day? Because it's something I was going to be doing back to back to back until I end it. So all this I have to, put in place to make sure that I was able to successfully go through the ride. So now, if we look at the borders, coming in from Europe, I divided this into 2, the European section and the African borders. The European part basically was just to cross from London to, into France, which is the European Union. So, and there I had to go through the channel. Crossing the European border was seamless. It was just like the border of a border post, that's the border police, where you get to do your immigration check, the custom check, and also the health check. The border police does all that. So it's just one check you need to do. Then the other part is where you just take all your equipment, all your bag and baggages into the scanner, where they scan out for if there are probably maybe any of all these banned substances in there. But coming into African border, it's totally different. You know, when you're crossing from London into France, now you're in the European Union. So the European Union from France to Spain is actually soft border. You don't see anybody because it's part of the European Union. But when you get into Morocco, crossing into Morocco, then I began to experience a totally different set of border management. You know, I began to see that while we were on the ferry that's crossing from Algeciras, the port of Algeciras, the boundary of Europe into Morocco, there was a Moroccan immigration officer on the ship. And there, our immigration papers was processed. So I was processed. So my thinking was, oh, when I get into Morocco, it's just to ride on into the city of Tangier, you know, the way I did when I crossed into France from London. But getting into Morocco, it was a totally different ballgame because I had to go through the same immigration checks that I went on the ship. And the question I was asking the official there is, if I was gonna do these checks here to go through immigration, why did you have to do the same when we were on the ferry? And they said that was the process. And after clearing the immigration there, you still have to go to clear the custom, then you have to go to clear the police, then you have to go to clear the border police. So it's like duplication of efforts I experienced at the Moroccan border. And this is not just about the Moroccan border. It was the same thing I experienced all through from Morocco into Mauritania, into Senegal, into Mali, into Burkina Faso, then Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, then down into Benin Republic. So what I noticed about the African border, they're actually not porous, they are quite safe. And they are quite safe and they are quite secured because, you know, if you look at the way the border were manned, I think they are overstaffed. If you ask my opinion, they are overstaffed because you have several layers of checks. While when you are in the Europe, the border police does your immigration, does all these other documentary health checks and every other things for you. But in Africa, you keep moving from one table to the other, So you go through rounds of about 3-4 tables. Even when you get in the border, the immigration who are just supposed to check everything, you have to even go to a separate place where you get the entry permit for your motorbike. So I noticed on Africa, there's a lot of bureaucracy, but are the borders safe? They are very safe. I went through all these places, all those borders. I had no issue with security. And the staff there were cautious. They're quite cautious people. Respect begets respect. You talk to people, you address people well, they respond back to you the same way. So I didn't experience any hostility with all the border control officials. They treated me with respect. I had all my papers okay. Yes, there were high level of bureaucracy. Then infrastructure, they lack quite a lot of infrastructure because if you want to go through the Interpol checks in other countries, it doesn't take long. Like even while I was going through Interpol check at the Moroccan border, and it actually happened in all these other borders, it took average of about 30 minutes or 40 minutes to actually check that you are not flagged on the Interpol database. And usually, most other places, this get done in about 3-5 minutes. So probably lacking infrastructure to actually enhance that. Then if you look at the borderlanders, when you look at the borders in Europe, like Dover, where you have the ports, where you take the ferry or the Eurotunnel to actually cross from London into France, you see the borderlanders there, the kind of services, people who live there and the services they render are actually, let me call it the white collar services, to help to enhance movement of trade from one country to another. But when you come into Africa and you see the borderlanders around there in the border, the kind of trade they actually render to you there, they are trade, how will I call it? Let me use the word survival trade, where you get to buy things like maybe you need some refreshments, those kind of services that keeps, body and soul together. So if you look at the value of those kind of trade, I think they are quite minimal compared to what I saw being done in Dover, that's the export terminal, the border terminal in the UK. Okay, so crossing through all these places, what are my challenges? Basically, while I was crossing through the Europe, the challenges I went through basically is about temperature, the freezing temperature. You have the very strong winds, actually very strong cross and headwinds on the European continent. Coming into Africa, the challenges is slightly different and a lot more. I had to cope with the extreme heat of the Sahara and extreme cold at night. Then the fine grains of the Sahara, it's, I'm blowing, the strong wind blowing this fine grain, it's like 1,000 needles trying to poke into your riding gear to hit you. So those are a lot of the challenges. Then, sometimes, well, I ran into sandstorm. I was lucky to come out alive. And the other part is there are wild animals in Africa, because of the nature of our continent is we have the wilds around us. So there are possibility you come across wild animals. And I actually came across lion and some other wild cats. Then also the other key part is the loneliness on the Sahara. Sometimes you get to be on the road for close to 4 hours without even seeing another car or anyone. And while crossing, okay, let me just, while crossing the Sahara, while crossing through the Sahara, when I was gonna be exiting in from Morocco into Mauritania, I think that was the first time I came across people, it would be wrong for me to call them illegal immigrants. I would rather want to use the word economic migrants because I can't tell whether they are legal or not, but the way they are, I think about a group of about 100 people who are stuck somewhere close to the border. And, they were like, the Moroccan custom where immigration and border police were looking at them. They too were looking, they didn't move, they were just there. So I assume probably they are looking for how to cross into Morocco. So basically, that was just the experience I saw. And even while crossing there, I wasn't attacked by these people. Some of them actually even stopped me to exchange pleasantries with me. So, like before embarking on the ride, I did a lot of reading about Africa. And the reason I did made me as an African to be skeptical of other Africans because there was so much negative and scary write-up about the nature of African borders, African roads, and the threats all over there. But I did 3,000 kilos in Europe and about 9,000 kilometers crossing Africa through the lonely and isolated places. I had no issue with security. I had no issue with any threats on my life. Rather, what I discovered was the friendliness, the hospitality of the African people. Now, this was my experience in Europe. These are various places all through from London, France, into Spain, into Gibraltar. This was me here in Gibraltar, then out to Algeciras, where I exited the European continent and crossed into Africa. Now, look at this experience in Africa vis-a-vis the experience in Spain, in Europe. You can see that while in Europe, it was basically me and maybe one or two other people who we shared, the moments together, the friendship or the stories together. But when I got into Africa, the whole equation was totally different. This was Morocco, down into Mauritania, down into Mali, Senegal, all the West African, North and West African countries. People came out en masse. People showed hospitality. They showed, the friendliness, the bond in the African community. The borderlanders came out en masse to welcome me, to make me feel hospitable. Even when I was even going, I found these people actually even ride with me, maybe like about 200 kilos out of their city into my next country I was going into. That is the nature of the hospitality I experienced in Africa and the friendliness I shared with all the people. And that talks about the bond that we have in Africa.
You have 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'm just going to share a story about my experience in Mali, or excuse one in Mali. While leaving the border, there's the border between Senegal and Mali is called Diboli. That's the name of the border town, Diboli. So while leaving Diboli, I had a little delay at the border. And by the time I clear all the custom and immigration, it was about 7 p.m. in the evening, rather. And while darkness suddenly fell, and while riding, I ran into a ditch. Actually, there was a truck coming in the opposite direction, trying to avoid the pothole. He swerved into my lane, and I tried to avoid impacting the truck. I swerved into the shoulder, and at the shoulder, there was a ditch. I ran into that ditch, and that busted the alloy rim of my bike. And it was a lonely and isolated place. This was the community, and these people came to my rescue. It's a community of about 3 huts. It was about 9 p.m. in the night. These people could have actually, they are in the border town. These people could have done anything they want to me. They could have killed me if they are as bad as they were, African rural community as portrayed in the media. But these people, these borderlanders came to my rescue. They took me to their community. They kept my bike. I was able to call my interpreter who rented a vehicle and came to pick me up in this town. By the time the interpreter came to rescue me with the vehicle, it was about 1 a.m. in the morning. These people stood with me there from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. They didn't make me feel alone. And that shows the kind of hospitality you get across Africa. In spite of all the negative media, I discovered African people have humanity in them. There's friendliness. And that was what I experienced on the ride. And as you know, the ride took global dimension. It was on CNN, everywhere, all over the world. Everybody around the world celebrated it. However, also in December, this December, that's just some last 2 months ago, I did a West African road trip for my Christmas holiday. I actually started the ride on the 20th of December, and I rode from Lagos to Benin Republic, to Lomé, then to Burkina Faso, down to Mali, then down to Guinea-Conakry. And I tell you, the experience of the border was still the same. Maybe not as efficient as European borders, but people are friendly, the borders are safe. I rode alone, I had no issue. So I'm comparing 2 experiences, riding Trans-Sahara motorbike adventure, that's from London to Lagos, then also doing the West African road trip. The 2 were all filled with pleasant experiences. And I think I advise everyone, let's explore the African border. It's not as bad as portrayed in the media. And it's full of very beautiful experiences. I'm happy I'm an African. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adeyanju. Thank you for sharing your experience with us in terms of your movement across African borders. I mean, it reaffirms the humaneness in Africans, and looking at those spaces where one would have thought that barbaric acts would be perpetrated. You have explained and shown to us how you were received and been taken care of when the need came up. So I'm actually elated that our speakers today have spoken to quite a number of issues. And for me, I would say that we could see how state actors latch on the opportunity of the COVID-19 pandemic to implement some of their policies, which has to do with migration restrictions and border enforcement and all of those. And part of what we're trying to talk about here is going forward, how do we then address these things? We also have scholars who have spoken to the concept of open borders, such as Pukatas, Carent, Brown, from different points of view, especially from the materialist Marxism and the liberal utilitarian points of view, where they've advanced the benefits of the benefits that accrues to different stakeholders in this whole mix, such as the citizens, the migrants, and the host country, and specifically who benefits more from this arrangement of open borders. And we have also seen how state actors have used the instrument of governance to determine who gets what, when, and how. And this speaks to the question of we, her, and then you, her. I mean, some of these things, Professor Chris Isike spoke to this the gathering yesterday, which was organized on campus, where African leaders have actually used the instrument of power, of governance rather, to determine this kind of things and to distinguish between who the citizens are and who the migrants are. And when we take this further, we look at African borders, we look at the concept of border openness. I think these are the kind of things we need to have this conversation more. When we talk about border openness or open borders, when we advocate for that in Africa, what exactly are we talking about? Perhaps if we do an in-depth whatever of that, it would help us to really understand how African leaders or African states see borders and how that affects the policies that they make in terms of border management, migration controls, and all of those. So I would just throw this open to the House. Any of our presenters would feel like responding to this, and anybody in the audience. I've seen quite a number of border scholars. I've seen Dr. Wafulu Okumu. This is a scholar that I respect so much. And so on this point, at this point, rather, I would open the floor for more conversations on this. If you have a question to ask, or if you have a point to raise, please kindly raise your hand, and then I would unmute for you to make your contributions. In the meantime, I can see a question in the Q&A box. It says, I think countries prefer to address the symptoms of migration issues rather than the causes of economic, political, humanitarian security instability. No one wants to be a migrant as a primary option. Border control is affected by security instability away from the borderline. What conversations must be had? What accountability must states hold each other to for us to address the primary issue created by migration? Movement for free trade is affected by fears of uncontrolled migration. How do we begin to address primary issues fueling the fears? That's a question raised by Pona Nkoza. So I don't know if any of our presenters would want to, any of our speakers would want to speak to that. And like I said, if you have any question, please kindly indicate that and I would unmute. Can any of our speakers speak to that question being raised? Or anybody in the audience who would want to contribute to that?
I can say something.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the question about movement for free trade, how it's affected by fears of uncontrolled migration. I mean, the question, I would respond by saying there's no such thing as uncontrolled migration, because we are falling into the rhetoric of the rhetorics we have in this policy platform, particularly run by EU or any other funding organizations, where they label migration as uncontrolled, safe, orderly, and so on. So when you talk about the borderlands, there is no such thing as uncontrolled migration, because it's very much, even if it seems uncontrolled and fluid, it's very much regulated in its own ways. I would be very cautious on using such terms, but on how to address these issues or of fear of what we call uncontrolled migration would be using, for instance, the experience we had along the Ethiopian-Kenyan border, where free movement and also informal trade has been under the legal context, where the two governments have agreed to open up the border for the border community to engage in economic activities without any restriction. And so, and that would have help in many ways, but at the same time, particularly when it comes to COVID and other incidents such as conflict, however, using such terms would be used, as Samuel you mentioned, by the governments or by the state to further strengthen the border control and make the borders even more hard for people to cross. But I just wanted to say we really need to be cautious on how we label the migration patterns in such ways. I will leave the other questions for the other participants to respond to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Kia. I would like to take my point further by asking this question. When we look at the African Union Protocol on Free Movement, and then the Continental Free Trade Agreement, all of these policies are meant to facilitate movement of Africans. In ECOWAS region, they call it community citizens, to facilitate the movement of community citizens. I mean, these are all built up to facilitate trade and movement of persons within the African continent. But what do we witness today? We see a situation where African states are securitizing, and militarizing their borders. And beyond that, taking that beyond that, we see a situation where, through the instrument of governance, African leaders demonize migrants, and that has actually led to a number of issues, which a lot of scholars have written about. So what does openness of African borders mean? Does it mean that the physical borders are removed so that people can actually move freely, or to strengthen the institutions, the institutions to facilitate the movement of Africans and for them to be able to live wherever they are able to find themselves? So these are some of the things I would like us to talk about.
Okay, Samuel, can I make a comment?
Please go ahead.
Yes, so on the openness of borders depends. Actually, in the literature, it speaks to three things. One, entry. How is it easier? Like our border enthusiast has narrated the way some borders in Europe, you can't even know. I've crossed some borders in Europe. You don't know you are crossing the border actually. You just find yourself the other side. So in terms of entry, how difficult or how is it easy for you to get from point A to B? Two is about now, it's possible to cross a border easily, make it in terms of getting the papers. It's kind of a swift process. But when you get to the other side, now the issue comes up around membership and participation in that society. That is another aspect of open borders. So those three: entry, membership, and participation in that society. So the more, there can't be just, it's not either these borders are neither closed or open. It's just the degree. It's a continuum. How open, some borders are more open than others. So depending on three things: participation and membership in the society once you cross to the other side, and then also entry. There are certain countries, like if you go to Europe, they know, or in the West, some people use marriage to get papers. And because of that, some countries are very strict. You have to prove. Just taking there your marriage certificate is not enough. You have to go through a whole process to prove that this is indeed a marriage. But in some cases, like, you just need to present a paper and you're good to go. So it's never open or closed like that. A binary, no, it's the degree that matters here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyani. Professor Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of comments on and also a question for Mr. Kunle. My comment really is that we, even before we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area, we live in a world that for the longer, at least starting from the 1980s, in our experience as Africans, we've been introduced to liberalization. And with the notion of liberalization of trade, you know, there is also the question of free movement, not only of goods and services, but also of people in the form of labor and also for purposes of conducting trade. But then for me, the intriguing question is, goods and services and people of a certain kind seem to be able to be allowed to move freely, but of another kind is only to a certain extent. And why is it that way? And also that brings in, therefore, the notion of securitization of mobility of certain categories of people. And also, therefore, it even leads me to the question that I have for Mr. Kunle. And I'm excited about his experience. I think I saw the documentary and the interview on CNN about his traveling experience. But the question I had for him was, in the African region, while he was crossing borders, what kind of, did you use a passport, first of all, to cross borders between nation states? And then which passport did you use? Was it an African passport, an ECOWAS passport, or was it a European passport? And that speaks to some of the comments that I've made and the concerns that I have with regard to mobility, especially on the African continent, where there is this securitization of movement and also securitization of borders, which really doesn't make sense.
All right, Sam, I don't know if I can go ahead, Dr. Sam.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the kind comment. I used actually 2 passports. I have dual nationality. I'm British born, so I had both the British passport and my Nigerian passport. And you know, the Nigerian passport is an ECOWAS passport. So while in Europe, I use my British passport to cross Europe, which is you know, like a free movement for me. I don't have to go through any visa or through the European countries. Then crossing into Morocco. Morocco is also visa free and for European citizens. So I had no issue crossing into Morocco. However, when I got into Mauritania, crossing from Morocco into Mauritania, then I started using my Nigerian passport, which is an ECOWAS passport. So, and that actually gave me free movement in all ECOWAS states. I'm sure, you know, Mauritania is partly ECOWAS, you know, because they exited and trying to come back. So, but there I had to pay for a visa on arrival, which was 35 euro for Nigerian passport, for African passport anyway, West African passport, sorry, and 50 euro for British passport. So I used my Nigerian passport in Mauritania. Then from Senegal, who are fully members of ECOWAS, it was free entry all through, and I didn't have to pay anything. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thanks a lot.
All right.
And basically, that's, for me, that's the concern, to say when we talk about policies that have to do with mobility of people on the African continent, what I was basically trying to hit at is, who is the architect of these policies? Is it us Africans, or they are policies that are drawn for us somewhere else, where we are taught what we ought to do with regards to people being able to move on the continent, and not even to go to the issue of us moving outside of Africa, because a lot of more movement happens within the continent than outside, but the movement is restricted. And therefore we are not as productive as we ought to be until we free ourselves in terms of the ability to move. I'm just thinking now of Namibia and Botswana, which actually have kind of shown the way for the Southern African region. And they're saying, okay, we are doing away with passports, and now we are going to use national identity cards for people who are crossing the border. And just to address one of the questions that you asked, Simon, when we talk about open borders, we are not saying you do away with those institutions that are put by the state to facilitate the movement of people, but also to be able to see people moving. We need those for administrative purposes. I mean, if I move into a city, I need to be able to go to the local authorities and register myself with them to say, I'm in this city, so that they can render me services that I need. And I may also contribute to, the functioning of the city in whichever way that particular city wants me to contribute. So we're not saying it's a free movement where you do away with the collection of vital information that is necessary for the provision of services. People can move, but you don't stop or hinder their movements. And yet they should be able to register themselves for purposes of administration and also for the provision of services.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chris, for your comment. And just to add to the concerns which you raised actually with Mr. Adeyanju, I think Dr. Moyani also talked about it, how it's very difficult for Africans to move within Africa, but it's easy for you to move beyond the shores of Africa. Well, I would just say I have a personal experience where I've been denied by a Southern African country entry 4 times now. Let me just leave it at that. Let me leave it at that. Despite the fact that I've traveled beyond the shores of Africa, I have visas on my passport and all of those. In asking why that happened, there is actually no reason. So these are some of the conversations we should have. How do we facilitate more movement of Africans within Africa, rather than stiffening the borders or stiffening the movement for people. I don't know if there is any other comment or question from the audience.
Just a quick one for our border enthusiasts.
Okay.
Kunle, if you're here, if you can hear me, I'm just imagining, I know this is very difficult for you to imagine. Do you think this is a journey you would recommend for an African woman to cross?
The answer is yes. And why did I say so? When you go on this kind of trip, you discover that hidden potentials in you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it may be scary at first, but what I say to people is go for it, do it, but plan very well. It took me a year to build a plan. I've shared my plan with a couple of people who wanted to do it. Yeah, so you shouldn't take them a year to build their plan. But if you plan well, you can do it. And when you do it, you'll be a better person. That's what I can just say. So please get a bike and do it.
Interesting. Okay, do we have any further comments? Okay, there is actually a hand. Okay, Stephen, you can speak.
No, thank you very much, sir, and good afternoon to all panel members. I saw the conference or the discussions held by the ISS, and I was quite excited when I saw, that we're getting into this type of conversation. And the reason for that for me is I have a particular interest in this area. I hope that gentleman was that you are not refused by South African authorities. I am the in charge or the head of South African ports of entry. And any conversation around borders is obviously an area of interest for me, and more so on the continent. But I just have one or two things that I perhaps have to say. And I have to say to Prof that there is an opportunity to bring in practitioners into the space, because it's practitioners that are influencing policy. It's practitioners that obviously, enforce some of these areas. And for me, the one experience that the gentleman has raised about, the multiple stops in a port of entry, it's a concern to all of us in working in the space. I'm working for immigration, but I'm also, part of a border management authority where we are now moving into an integrated setting. And the integrated setting is simply because we want to see how we ensure seamless movement through our ports of entry, particularly with South Africa and the neighboring 6 countries that she has. So for us, I'm quite excited, and I hope that there will be more such conversations. We are available, Prof. We are willing to engage on the matter of ports of entry. The particular area that you have raised is, what does it mean when we say open borders? And it's a conversation that we need to start opening up, because if we don't, in the field of practitioners or academics or researchers, the conversation is going to go anyway, in a particular direction. So perhaps at the areas that we are involved in, and I worked for the ISS before, so I have an understanding as a researcher in what is it that want to bring into the space for conversation. So I actually just wanted to introduce myself and say what my interest in the areas, and then encourage this type of conversation, because it becomes more and more important for us. At least from a brief South African experience, is that where I'm sitting is that we have not seen the total free movement after COVID, since we have lifted all restrictions. I'm just reflecting on the December festive period that we have just ended now, where we have seen less movement between ourselves and northern borders. Like, for instance, pre-COVID, we had do some comparative analysis, and there is still not movement that is taking place that is before. So I just want to submit that, and also appreciate everybody for the conversations that is going in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I can see our time is fast spent. I would just like to conclude the session and just start by sharing my screen. Okay, so one of the major aim of this conversation is to engage scholars and practitioners on this issue of African borders, the state of African borders in a post-COVID era, and we would like to document our findings in form of an edited volume. So we have a call for book chapters here. The title is COVID-19 and African Borders in Transition. And then we welcome scientific and empirical papers on the changing dynamics of borders and bordering in Africa, focusing on the meaning attributed to borders and how they were managed before, during, and after COVID-19. We have about 14 thematic areas, which we can as well go beyond this, depending on the content of what is being presented. So we welcome chapter contributions from scholars and practitioners of borders in Africa, and we hope to come up with an edited volume on these. My email is out here, samuel_okwade@yahoo.com. The CFP will also be circulated, and if you need for me to share the full call with you, you can write me on my email, and then I would definitely share that with you. So I want to thank all the speakers for speaking to us and sharing your thoughts and personal experiences on African borders today. I also want to say a big thank you to our audience who took our time to be a part of us. For those who have shared their thoughts and comments, we say thank you very much. Border issues in Africa is of paramount concern to me, and I would like to also have more and more of this conversation. It is on this note that I close this webinar, and I say thank you to all for joining. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.